thank you everybody for attending this webinar. I hope everybody's staying happy and healthy with all of the coronavirus that's going on in the world. So that said, I just wanted to let everybody know I'm giving my presentation from home. And there may be a little bit of background noise, so I just want to apologize ahead of time for that. My name is Amy Brooks. I'm a doctoral student at the University of Georgia New Materials Institute, where I conduct research on solid waste management as it pertains to plastic pollution under Dr. Jenna Jambeck. I'm also a National Geographic explorer, where I'm conducting research using satellite tagging technology to understand the movement of plastic waste from land to aquatic systems. And then last year, I spent much of the year as part of the National Geographic Sea to Source Ganges expedition, where we were trying to understand the movement or how exactly plastic waste is reaching the Ganges rivershed from land. But prior to all of that, a lot of my research involved the global trade of plastic scrap, and so I'm going to be talking about that today. We had a paper come out in 2018 that I'm going to be sharing findings from, and kind of giving a little bit of an update as far as how the global trade is has changed as of today. So first, let's talk about the production of plastic products. So as you can see from this graph, there's been a pretty big growth in plastic production over the past 70 years or so. So in 1950, only 2 million metric tons were produced globally. As of 2018, 359 million metric tons were produced. And so the bulk of this plastic that's made is actually in the packaging industry. So there's lots of plastic used in other industries, but packaging alone has contributed the most. And so that means that we're generating a lot of plastic products and therefore a lot of plastic waste as well. So it's estimated that as of 2017, 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic waste, plastic products have been made. And in turn, 6.3 billion metric tons of plastic waste has been generated. So that's a pretty significant amount of waste that we have to manage. That said, one of the things that Dr. Jambeck, my mentor, has published on is the estimated amount of plastic waste that's generated on land that reaches the sea. And so she estimated in 2015 that 8 million metric tons of plastic pollution enter the ocean annually. Some of the factors influencing this is rapid economic development coupled with lagging waste management infrastructure, which is what we're seeing in places like Southeast Asia and where we potentially could see it in Africa over the next few decades as Africa grows very rapidly and more people are entering into the middle class, being able to consume more products, etc. So hopefully as we learn more about plastic pollution and mitigation strategies, we can implement regulations and legislation and behaviors that will help to reduce the amount of plastic pollution generated in the region and kind of get ahead of it before it develops. And so big picture, what all this has to do with the plastic trade is that the 2015 paper that estimated the marine debris inputs did not account for the movement of plastic waste internationally. And so the goal of this research was to just better understand the global trends of plastic trade, to quantify then the impacts of Chinese policy. So pretty much right when we started conducting our research, China introduced their potential ban. So we were kind of racing against the clock to get this research underway. And then lastly, we wanted to see if we could determine how much this is contributing to the marine debris issue. So these are kind of the things I'll be talking about today. So back to this graphic, at the bottom there you can see that about 9% of plastic waste globally is recycled, 12% is incinerated, and the remainder is either landfilled or ends up in the natural environment. And this is somewhat difficult to measure at this moment in time. But what we're going to be focusing on today is the 9% that is collected for recycling. So once plastic is collected and baled, it can enter into domestic markets or international trade. So where I'm from, the plastics that enter domestic markets are usually going into like carpet manufacturing here in Georgia, where I live. Some of our plastics go up to North Carolina, which is a nearby state that can generate like detergent bottles out of our recycled polyethylene. But the rest of our plastics, it's a bit unclear as to where they go. So oftentimes they will end up going internationally. For instance, my county was shipping plastics to Canada recently, as well as China. And so the reason why this exists is that it allows us to divert waste from landfills or incineration. And interestingly enough, it's cheaper for exporting countries to ship plastic waste. So often there's empty shipping containers that are on shore. We can throw our plastic waste onto that and have decreased disposal costs. There's higher demand in international markets. And so there's kind of been this symbiotic relationship that's developed from these two things. And so as I mentioned, kind of coupled with that plastic production growth and plastic waste generation growth, we're also seeing a lot of growth in the trade of plastic waste. So since 1993, we've seen an increase in imports at 720% and an increase in exports of 820%. So the reason is I'm kind of going to be focusing on this column A and B, that gray and blue column. In the 90s, we saw rapid advances in recycling technology. So for instance, in the US, single stream recycling was introduced where people could throw all of their plastics and recycling materials into one bin. And at the same time, there was a lot of pushing for globalization and increasing international trade. So as far as plastic scrap, what we're talking about that's being traded today, we use data from the United Nations Commodity Trade Database, and they have 4 different categories for plastics that they track. And those are polyvinyl chloride, polystyrene, polyethylene, and a group called other plastics. This other plastics consists of PET, that's plastic bottle generally, as well as polypropylene, and these are just 2 polymers of plastic that they haven't come up with a harmonized trading code, so they're categorized as the other plastics group. But between other plastics and polyethylene, we have a lot of what's considered single-use plastics that are being traded. So we estimate that about 89% of all traded plastic scrap are single-use plastic items. So that's your bottles, your food containers, your plastic bags, etc. In 2016 alone, 134 different nations and territories participated in the trade of plastic scrap. For exports, 15 million metric tons were exported. You can see that the U.S., some countries in Europe and Japan are kind of leading in that quantity. From the import standpoint, 14 million metric tons were imported, with China being the leader in that quantity amount, followed by the U.S. and other countries. And all of that alone generated about 11.5 billion U.S. dollars. So it's a pretty significant chunk of change associated with this market. So globally, the major exporters are the United States, Japan, Germany, Mexico, and the United Kingdom. And these top 5 exporters all together contribute to 40% of the cumulative global trade. I will note that Hong Kong would have been included in this table as the #1 biggest exporter, but we decided to exclude Hong Kong because it's essentially a gateway into China. So a lot of plastic scrap goes to goes to Hong Kong and then moves across the border to China. As far as importing, again, China and Hong Kong are largely leading that at 72% just between the 2 of those countries or regions. Followed by the U.S., Netherlands, and Germany. And as you can see, after Hong Kong, there's a pretty significant dip in the quantity of plastics that are being imported. So we largely are focusing on China and Hong Kong as our importing countries. And so in this research, we wanted to kind of look at the economic and regional trends associated with this. So we largely used World Bank economic classifiers and regional classifiers. So from an economic standpoint, you can see that high income and upper middle income countries are largely contributing to imports. And then the high income countries are definitely leading in exports. But perhaps more telling than this is that 64% of all exports were conducted by OECD nations, while 78% of imports were into non-OECD members. And so what this means is that countries that do have waste management facilities and infrastructure are actually collecting that waste and potentially sending it over to countries that don't necessarily have adequate waste management infrastructure. From a regional standpoint, East Asia and the Pacific are largely leading in the importing of plastic scrap, while the East Asia, Europe, and North America are contributing to most of the exports. You'll notice down in the bottom right is that Africa has not really contributed a very significant amount to the global trade of plastic waste, but I still wanted to kind of focus on what's happening there because there is still some trade that is occurring. And so as of 2016, Africa had exported a cumulative amount of about 910,000 metric tons and imported about 650,000 metric tons. From a country standpoint, we can see that Tunisia, South Africa, Egypt, Tanzania, and Morocco are like the top regional exporters. And I wanted to show that in conjunction with the plastic waste generation rate for those countries. So in the figure to the right, the blue shading is associated with the amount of plastic waste that's generated on a daily basis. And those countries that are the regional exporters, we're seeing high amounts of waste generated. So that dark blue shading is more than 1,000 tons per day. From an importing standpoint, we have similar countries that are contributing to the importing in the region: Nigeria, Morocco, South Africa, Cote d'Ivoire, and Algeria. This figure to the right is now showing mismanaged plastic waste at the country level. And so you can see that Nigeria, for example, has potential significant amount of mismanaged waste. So the implication is that there is potential that plastic that is imported into these countries could maybe be mismanaged. The bottom line, kind of to summarize what I just went through, we see three major trends. High-income nations are contributing to most of global exports at 87%. Countries in Europe and North America are contributing to most of the exports at 46%. And then East Asian and Pacific countries have contributed to 75% of all imports. And again, Africa, I believe it was about less than 1% contribution to the global trade of plastic waste, but there is still some occurring there. And with the policy changes that have happened over the past few years, we may see some differences and some increase in imports and exports in the region. So again, those OECD members, those countries that have plastic waste management infrastructure, are potentially exporting their plastic waste to countries that do not have adequate infrastructure to manage it. So all of this said is that high-income nations located in North America and Europe are exporting plastic waste to middle and low-income nations located often in East Asia and Pacific. So now we're going to kind of focus on China because, as you may have heard in the news, China has contributed a good bit to this import. And alone, China has contributed to 45% of all global imports between 1988 and 2016. And so this figure here is showing the sources of Chinese imports in 2016. The thickness of the line is associated with the quantity. And so you can see actually Nigeria and Tanzania have both contributed to or sent over plastic waste to China back in 2016. So it's definitely, there's a definite flow from the region to China. So you may be wondering why China became this leading importer for the world. Well, in the 1980s and the 1990s, there was an emerging manufacturing markets in China, so a lot of plastic production is happening there. At the same time, there's been very rapid growth and more people in the middle class that have access to consumer and purchasing power. And then at the same time that technology was advancing in places like the US and Europe, where we had that single stream recycling where all of our products could go in one bin and we take it down to the end of the street and it kind of magically goes away. But what this means is that there's a bulk of material that needed to be managed, and end market that was willing to take it, as this allowed China to diversify their feedstock for plastic production. So rather than relying solely on virgin plastic resin, they could also use this recycled plastic that's collected and processed and can be used in plastic production. So again, this is kind of that symbiotic relationship that developed in the 90s that allowed us to get to this point. Now, from a waste management system, China's basically it's two parts. They have the formal government-run system that's primarily involved in the collection and transport of waste, and it's typically landfilled, or it can be sold to the informal waste sector, which are usually mom and pop small businesses, often disadvantaged citizens that have low socioeconomic status, which means that they often don't have formal organization and they can potentially have lacking environmental and safety regulation. So as you can imagine, there's a good bit of mismanaged waste in China. The paper from 2016 that Jenna Jambek published found that China has the highest potential for marine debris inputs from land. She found that between 1.3 to 3.5 million metric tons of marine debris enter the ocean from China per year. So we wanted to see what the imports of plastic waste meant for the marine debris. And we found that in addition to what's domestically generated plastic waste-wise in China, there's a potential of 10 to 13% more plastic waste to manage by mass from the import of plastic waste. And so we calculate that that may add an additional 300,000 metric tons of plastic marine debris from the country per year. So looking back at this historical chart, you can imagine after decades of importing plastic waste from the world, seeing higher and higher levels of contamination in the waste stream, that China started to explore ways to mitigate this. So that green column C, was the implementation of a temporary ban called the green fence. And this just basically introduced more stringent requirements for contamination levels for plastics that were imported there. And then that red column is for the more recent import ban in China that's colloquially referred to as the national sword. At time of publication, the import ban was not yet in place, so that's kind of just indicating that that was going to be happening in 2018. And as you can see, there were pretty significant dips in the quantities and trade values as we built up to 2018. So this policy, it doesn't just incorporate plastics. It's actually an import ban on 24 different waste materials. But for our intended purpose, we'll be focusing on plastic scrap. So that includes those 4 categories I discussed earlier: polyethylene, polystyrene, polyvinyl chloride, and that other plastic group. And what we wanted to explore for our research was the potential impact. So like I said, China has been the major importer in the world. They've taken 45% of cumulative global plastic waste, and now they suddenly have closed their doors on those 4 categories. So we wanted to see, well, how much is this going to displace plastic waste that would have potentially been imported by China? And so we found that by 2030, approximately 111 million metric tons of plastic waste would be displaced by the ban. 111 million metric tons is actually equivalent to 4.5 million full garbage trucks. So it's a pretty significant quantity of waste that will have to be managed. And as soon as the ban was put into place, we saw a pretty immediate impact. So there were reports of accumulating plastic waste within domestic borders. We saw increased costs and disruption for consumers. So this was in the form of increased tipping fees at landfills. So plastics that were collected for recycling were then actually interned into landfills because there was nowhere else to put it. So that cost is actually passed down to consumers. There are many reports of different communities shutting down their recycling and curbside pickup entirely here in the U.S. I mean, all of this just means that there is decreased diversion from landfill and incineration. So as I said, there's more plastics that are going to be and have been going to landfill and to incineration. There's also the implication that other countries would start seeing an increase in imports. If China wasn't taking it, then other countries might instead. And we did see that there are increases in India, Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, and others. And all 4 of these countries, interestingly enough, over the past 2 years have implemented their own import bans. So this national forward policy, the import ban in China, has actually had cascading effects across the globe. And so from an actionable standpoint, what can we do to help mitigate this? What can we do to help the recycling market? In my opinion, it takes a few different things and lots of synchronized intervention strategies. So first is looking at upstream solutions. So how can we reduce our plastic waste generation from the get-go? But also, if we are going to be recycling it and we are going to be reusing plastic waste, how can we design packaging to retain value and become more recyclable? And that especially needs to be happening on domestic territory. Second, we can motivate for country-level commitments, so we can aim to reduce plastic use and waste, and there have been quite a few commitments over the past few years. We also need better tracking. So one of the biggest difficulties in this, in tracking and studying this plastic waste trade is that there's not a lot of detail, and it's quite difficult to really understand the movement of plastic waste. So I can see that the United States sends a certain amount to China, but I don't quite know what happens after that. So it's very hard to trace. We can also implement country-level commitments like strict liability. So this is essentially holding the country that is exporting liable for how that waste is managed downstream and in another place. Lastly, we can drive the development of global agreements, and we have certainly seen this in the time since this has been implemented. You probably heard about extended producer responsibility. So this is brands that use plastic products having more responsibility for how their products are managed as waste. And then there's been changes to the Basel Convention, which is an international convention and legislation essentially that helps to manage properly the movement of waste material internationally. And so Norway has actually led a good bit in that regard. So back in 2019, Norway proposed an amendment to the Basel Convention that they believe would help to address the global challenge of marine litter by better regulating the transboundary shipments of plastic waste. And so the amendment was passed back in May of 2019, and we'll see the changes come into place in January 2021. And mainly, this policy will help to differentiate contaminated plastic waste from uncontaminated plastic waste that's bound for other countries. And knowing that will help to ensure that exported plastic waste is not contaminated to a point of causing harm in another environment. And lastly, this will help to, this policy is going to require notification procedures for plastic waste movement. So it will require countries that are importing plastic to acknowledge that this is a potentially harmful material and that it needs to be managed properly. So it definitely is going to be helping to regulate this a little bit better and provide a better understanding for both countries, both the exporter and the importer, of how that waste will be managed. And we'll be definitely paying attention to how this develops over the next few years and seeing the impact that this is having. So all that said, I kind of wanted to talk about a personal experience that I had with this international trade. So back right when our paper came out in 2018, Jenna and I traveled to Vietnam on a National Geographic grant. Vietnam has a pretty significant coastal population of 56 million people. It's a low middle income country with a waste generation rate of 0.79 kilograms per person per day. So a pretty low waste generation rate. However, they are definitely experiencing that rapid growth coupled with the lagging waste infrastructure. So they see some of the highest potential for mismanaged plastic waste to reach the ocean at about 0.5 million metric tons per year. And this is actually a photo that I took in Katbag, Vietnam, that's showing mismanaged plastic in the ocean. Based on the import data that we were looking at, we estimate that about 2.5% of plastic waste is an additional quantity to be managed within the country. That's in addition to their domestic plastic waste generation. So we went to a recycling village in northern Vietnam, and it was fascinating to see. We saw women cutting the labels off of plastic film. I don't know if you can see this. There's some film in there that has a British flag on it. We saw some labels that were from Spain. So we were seeing this trade happening right before our eyes. And so essentially there was a sort of a microeconomy where these women would cut the labels off. They would sort the plastic into colored or clear plastics, and then they would sell it to their neighbors, who would then clean it, shred it, and prepare it for extracting into plastic resin. We did see some potentially safety issues as far as exposure to very hazardous chemicals in the air from burning and melting plastic. We saw them cooking lunch next to the machinery where they were melting plastic. So there's a lot of implications as far as the health and safety for these workers. We saw lots of stormwater drainage that was blocked by this plastic scrap. And so it was just very eye-opening to see it in person right in front of us. And it was a very good reminder that behind all of this plastic scrap and all this talk about the trade of plastic scrap, there are people that are living it and breathing it and managing this. And so we have to be very careful with the policy that we develop as we move forward, and ensuring that these people's livelihood is protected and that they are safe if they are managing this plastic waste. With that, I'm going to wrap up with this last photo. So these are from some of my travels throughout the world. And it's just a reminder that, like I said, behind all this plastic and marine debris and trade of plastic scrap, there are people, and there are lots of happy faces working on this issue. And I'm just very excited to be continuing my research and work on the issue as well. So with that, I suppose I'll pass it on and we can do questions.
Thanks, Amy. That was great. We do have a question that came through a while ago from Gregor saying, from which years are these numbers? I think that was referring to imports and exports of plastic, those numbers.
Sure. So the data that I presented here today is from 1988 to 2016. We're actually hopefully going to be updating those values from 2017 and 2018, but we haven't quite finished that research yet, so hopefully that will be coming out soon.
Thanks, Amy. Feel free to type your questions in the chat box at the side if anyone has any. In the meantime, I have a question about since they sort of prevented plastic, or since China decided to limit the amount of plastic that they're importing for recycling and that, do you know if there are any kind of plans of where that will go? Will it collect in the countries that were exporting it, or is Vietnam opening its borders to collect more of the recycling waste?
Yeah, so there, like I think I mentioned that there were some reports of accumulating waste domestically. Now we have, just from what I've looked at in the data that I haven't published or we haven't made it public yet, but we have seen an import increase in different countries. So we'll definitely be exploring where in the world we might be seeing this plastic waste moving to instead of China and South Asia.
All right, thanks. Can you also expand on whether the recycled material that they produce in China and Vietnam and places like that, is that in any way linked? Is there an increase in production of recycled and reused plastic there? So the plastic production, is it related to the recyclate production in any way?
That I unfortunately am not sure about. So we've had some of the production data is basically tied up in industry data, so it's either unavailable or very expensive to access, which is part of our limitations here. So I don't know for sure about the production of recycled plastic waste, or excuse me, recycled plastic products, but we do know that there is definitely increased production still going on. So we're not really seeing any decrease in general plastic production.
We have a comment from Isabel saying, thanks for the talk, Amy. Some bacteria have shown the potential to biodegrade some plastics. Do you think this could be a partial solution to the problem? Are these bacteria really being applied at large scales? Thanks.
Interesting question. So I have seen some promising biodegrading bacteria. It's definitely not my expertise. I think depending on how it develops, we could potentially scale it. I think I saw some research out of Japan that was exploring scaling some bacterial degradation of plastic in the marine environment. It's that environment that's going to be very specific to how it breaks down, and then there's always the unknown as far as what the waste from those bacteria will look like. So I think it's definitely a very interesting solution, and maybe something that will develop over the next few years. But definitely remains to be seen, and I think that's a really interesting question. I just, unfortunately, I'm not an expert in that, so I don't quite know how that's going to develop.
There's a question from Matilda saying, in April 2019, the Philippines sent ships back to Canada with plastic waste. What's going on there?
I'm not certain about that specific example. What my guess is that the waste that Canada sent to the Philippines likely had high levels of contamination. And so what we're seeing is that a lot of these bans get exemptions if the plastics that they send are in good enough shape, so they don't have other material in them, they're not dirty, they're already clean and basically ready for processing for recycling. But what's happening is that single stream recycling that we have here in the US, people throw in very dirty plastics, and they'll throw in things that are not recyclable. And so what it does is it introduces contamination into that bale. And so then if the plastics recyclers are sending those abroad, then they're sending potentially contaminated plastic. So it could be any form of contamination. It could be a mixture of HDPE plastic with PET plastic, and that's technically contaminated because it's not a single polymer ready to go for recycling. So that would be my guess, is that the Canadian waste that they sent over was probably very contaminated, and so the Philippines did not want to purchase it, so they sent it back. And I believe that the Philippines have implemented a ban on plastic imports since the Chinese ban as well.
Thanks, Amy. Asking if you had any suggestions for startups that are trying to work with plastic waste and how they could manage it effectively. A Norway-based startup is trying to bring a product made out of recycled plastic. Is there any suggestions how they can manage it or who they could collaborate with? I think he or she is referring to a company based in Norway that's looking to make products out of recycled plastics. And they're wondering if you have any suggestions on how they could manage this effectively or who they could collaborate with.
That sounds very interesting. I would love to know what the company is. As far as partnerships, I'm not quite sure. I think that, we see a lot of the countries that export a lot of waste that still import a lot of waste as well. So if the suggestion is that this company based in Norway would be managing Norwegian plastics, then they certainly could purchase plastics in Norway to do so. But yeah, I think it would be, if I could see what the company was and kind of understand their business strategy, that would be helpful. I guess I'll address these couple of questions that have come in most recently. So the ecverse@gmail.com has said that the contaminated waste could hold huge problems for the spread of pathogens around the world. That's a really good point. There's definitely that's definitely something kind of pertinent now with the coronavirus going around. So contamination, like I said, is kind of there's different forms of contamination that can include different materials being there, but certainly there's also just like biologically contaminated waste that could probably help, unfortunately, spread potential pathogens or just introduce a foreign pathogen into another place, which is not great. And I think that the policy on contamination and having requirements for low contamination rates will help reduce that. And then a question from Jenny on what types of plastic are not recycled or not wanted. We see that some polyvinyl chloride, so that's like PVC piping, we see that it's traded. We see that polystyrene is traded, but these are both polyvinyl chloride. PVC is typically used in more durable industries, so it's not necessarily designed for single use or quick discarding, and that's why we see a little bit lower recycling rate for it. Then the polystyrene is essentially, it is recyclable, but it doesn't generate much useful recycled polymer. So it's really those like hard plastics and the film plastic that we see the most trading. And then, but it's more concerning is our plastics that are used in packaging that have multi-material layers. So for instance, like a candy bar has a plastic liner and an aluminum layer that helps to prevent moisture entering into the packaging, which keeps it shelf stable. But unfortunately, that combination packaging layer makes it very low value because it's very expensive to extract out the metal and the plastic to be used again. So there are definitely ways that we could design packaging products, our single-use plastic products, to be more recyclable. And I think that that's something that we are definitely pushing for in the future. Nina, thank you for the comment. That is right on the money as far as those low-value plastics that aren't being collected for recycling, that are causing a lot of issues on the ground in places that don't have the waste management infrastructure for proper collection. So you're absolutely right. Those sachets, I've seen those in many different places, and those are definitely not taken up for recycling at this point in time. So increasing that material thickness for LDPE is, or that low density polyethylene, is a great example of increasing the value of that material so that it is taken up for recycling. Well, thank you all for listening in today, and please take care of yourselves with the coronavirus happening. And I just appreciate the time and the chat about this topic, and hopefully we'll have some exciting research coming out about this as well as the Ganges work shortly. So thank you all again.
Thank you so much, Amy. Really appreciate the talk.
Sure, thank you. Feel free, anybody, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out through email or Twitter. I'd love to hear from you.